Okay, so I want to go back and talk a little bit about recap as far as when Daniel was written. All right. There are different schools of thought on this, but generally, the biblical scholars, the ones that, go back and read the Hebrew and the Aramaic and look at all the history, context, and all that, generally they think that chapters 1 through 6, which have, largely been the visions that the kings or leaders of Babylon have seen, and then them being interpreted, as well as the lion and the fiery furnace stories, that part, chapters 1 through 6, was written or came together in its present form in about the late 4th, early 3rd century. All right. So that would be what? The late 300, no. Yeah.
Oh, if y'all can see this.
Oh, is that from
Oh, cool.
The NIV Bible,
Mhm.
study Bible.
That's chapter 4?
No, that's the first.
Yeah.
The first vision with the
different.
gold and all the different
Yeah.
metals down to iron.
I've seen that chart before and forgotten about it.
Cool.
Yeah. If you've got an NIV study Bible, it really is interesting, and it lays out the kingdoms that align with each of the sections of the statue.
Yeah. And that symbolism continues into chapter 7. All right. So chapters 1 through 6, I think were written, that late 4th, early 3rd century. And then chapters 7 through 12, 7 through 11 were written later, perhaps as later as late 2nd century. All right. And we're going to get into that today. And a lot of it's having to do with the symbols of these different visions and dreams and what rulers they seem to represent. So as we get into chapter 7, there's symbolism that really strongly suggests Antiochus the Fourth, all right, who was Greek, and he is the one that is described in Maccabees as desecrating the temple. He went in and did all kinds of terrible things, made everybody eat pork and do all that kind of stuff. And so, so there's thinking that these chapters were written later. And then there's parts of Daniel that were written even a little bit later that we looked at before when we did the Apocrypha. They're sometimes considered as part of the Apocrypha. And so I guess we'll look at those again to get the whole picture of Daniel, because most of us probably don't remember doing that. Okay, another big thing is, remember, we talked about this early on a little bit, that a good portion of Daniel was written in Aramaic. The first little bit of Daniel was written in Hebrew. And then from there through chapter 7 was written in Aramaic. And then chapter 8 was written, from there on, it's written in Hebrew. All right. And they have confirmation of a good portion of that through the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in Qumran. So anyhow, and Aramaic, was the day-to-day language, but it also, at this time, when the first part of Daniel was written, was the language used between nations in that area, in that part of the world. It was sort of the international language, especially for trade and commerce. And the Aramaic used in Daniel is, well written. All right. It's like a pretty educated person was writing it, is my interpretation of that. But the Hebrew that's used in the latter half of Daniel is not a very sophisticated Hebrew, for the folks, the Hebrew scholars see. So anyhow, so just kind of some linguistic kinds of things, language kinds of things that play into Daniel. So, and we're going to see some of that as we read through chapter 7. There's a couple of places that some Bibles, the way they translate it, are not necessarily, some of the scholars differ in terms of what is the more accurate translation than how the NSRV does. So, all right. So we ready? Ready to roll?
So when you date this, you say it occurred at 300 or whatever, it sounds to me like a story that moved from one area to another and then another. It's like our friend Chauncey said, all his stories are true. They've just been embellished a bit. So, this is not something that happened at a certain date. It's that happened over a period of time.
There's some, the thing about Daniel is, like, they're from Babylon, historical records in Babylon. We've got pretty precise dates and sequence of rulers in Babylon. So that's how they're able to figure a lot of this out, is because of those records. And then all the Greek rulers and then the Romans and stuff, we've got pretty specific dates and names and places and all that from those records, which are being used to help date the writings of.
But what I'm kind of thinking is this is a story that has developed over 500 years.
Yeah. That's my interpretation of it, that it is, and the symbolism, because another key piece to this, and C.O., the writer of our book, he gets a lot into this about the similarities between the imagery in these visions in Daniel and imagery used and symbols used in Babylon and by Canaanites. Of course, there are some pretty significant differences, but some similarities in imagery that was used in those cultures in addition. So, which in my mind, that kind of makes sense, It's like, it's hard for our civilization here, our culture here in the United States, they're to totally separate out all the different cultures that make up the United States. Cinco de Mayo is this week. All the stores have their sales ads this week are focusing on Mexican foods. So
We should have some good music in the neighborhood.
Oh, well, the Brazilian folks next door to me, when there's a Brazilian holiday, I get lots of good music outdoors. So, okay, all right. So some names that are becoming more familiar to us: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, or Mede, and Cyrus, who was, what nationality was Cyrus?
Persian.
Persian. All right, 2 points. Okay, I also want to go back and read a comment that Sal made about sort of the meaning of Daniel, the meaning of it. And this is from page 6 of the introduction of our book, that the authority of the book of Daniel as scripture lies in its power to inspire and shape the community of faith. The book of Daniel functions as scripture inasmuch as it instructs the community as to the ways of God and the ways that community members should conduct themselves before the sovereign God. So it was helpful for me to go back and read that as we get into some of the imagery here in chapter 7. Because in a lot of ways, this is, there's a lot of similarities with the imagery that we looked at in Revelation, a few years ago. So, all right. So chapter 7, we're going to be looking at all of it today. And would somebody read verses 1 through 8?
Okay, I have it.
Okay.
In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. Then he wrote down the dream. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I watched to stand on 2 feet, then as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being, and a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, "Arise, devour many bodies." After this, as I watched, another appeared like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads. The dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Boy, that must have been some good weed.
I know. Have any of you ever had nightmares like this? No, this is some really powerful imagery here in terms of the 4 beasts. And we're going to go back and talk about these 4 different beasts. All right. Stylistically, in terms of the writing, there's a big shift here with verse 7. With chapter 7. In the previous chapters, the visions and all were described more in 3rd person. Here now with 7, Daniel's visions are reported in 1st person. All right, so that's a big shift. So, all right, so going back to verse 1, this talks about it being the 1st year of King Belshazzar. So he's sort of placing it historically, even though they think this was written much later. He times it as being in 1st year of King Belshazzar, but the symbolism of these 4 beasts as we get into it indicates that it was actually written in much later. All right, so the 4 winds. All right, so what do you think the 4 winds of heaven would indicate? It's real basic.
North, south, east, and west.
Yep. All right, so the north, south, east, and west, stirring up the great sea. And so the great sea is thought to refer to either like the Mediterranean Sea or the great sea of creation. So whether this could be reflective of sort of the chaos of the cosmos kind of thing. All right. And then, so then 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. Okay, so these first 3 beasts of the 4 each of them are described as being like some other beast. All right. Like a lion, like a bear, like a leopard. All right. And then the fourth one is just described, and these first three, let me back up. These first three are all described in a passive voice. Okay. Its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up, and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being. And then the bear was raised up on one side, and I'll come back to talk about that. Then the leopard had 4 wings of a bird on its back, and dominion was given to it. All right, so passive, they're not doing it. Something else is doing it to them. All right, but then that fourth beast was terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong, and it was devouring, breaking in pieces and stamping what was left with its feet. So this fourth beast was much more active. All right. So what does all that imagery of those 4 beasts say to you?
It's the 4 major empires that ruled over time. I think Babylonia, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then the last one was Rome. And I'm cheating because I'm looking at my little chart here.
All right, so different interpretations have a little bit different sense of this. Sao in this book, he's saying, or Sao is saying that it's Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and then the Greeks.
I don't know. It makes more sense to me that the last beast sounded more like Rome than Greece.
I think there were a lot of similarities between Rome and Greece, for sure. Yep. Sao talks a lot about Antiochus IV and the destruction he did, how destructive he was in Israel and desecrating the temple and all of that. So if we get into Rome, we're getting in, if it's Rome, then that's getting into the time period just before Jesus and through Jesus. So, and they know that Daniel was written before, at least a good portion of the scholars know that it was written before then. So, all right, my phone.
Yeah, I mean, think Alexander the Great. You know, he ruled as much as Rome did. You know, in the 350 BC era. So,
Right. Yeah. And that's part of symbolism that some of this gets into. All right. So do you hear any similarities between here and any of the other stories so far in Daniel?
Yeah, well, the first beast reminds me of Nebuchadnezzar, what happened to him, because they said that he was an animal, but then his wings were plucked off and was lifted up, and he was given 2 feet like a human, and the human mind given to it. And remember when Nebuchadnezzar finally recognized God, that his senses came to him, and he was kind of blessed. His rule was blessed from then on. When he was the gold head, of the statue that we read about. So that kind of reminded me of that, because he had, he had become an animal because he didn't believe in God. But
Right. Okay, so then the second beast then was considered to be similar to Darius, the Mede or Mede, M-E-D-E. And so I want to talk a little bit about the second beast, the bear. All right, so he's described in the verse as raised up on one side. So yeah, I see a perplexed look, Tom, because I think the commentators are kind of perplexed too. What could this mean? So whether he in the vision is posing himself to strike, raising up on one side, or Ciel talked about there is imagery in other cultures at that time that wait a minute, the tusk.
Well, they definitely raised up on one leg and went and destroyed Babylon
Yeah,
that night. Rise and devour many bodies.
Well, yeah, maybe also the raising up on one side could be, as the story goes, divided conquerors, one being stronger than the other, perhaps the Medes and the Persians going into Babylon or someplace. But raising up on one side almost sounds like one group stronger than the other group, so a divided kingdom.
maybe.
Susan just said something a second ago too that is really powerful.
Sorry, that's okay.
She mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar became an animal when he didn't believe in God, and that just struck so true. Just think about right now, all the monsters that don't believe in God, and all the, I'm thinking Putin right now, and you look at Hitler, and you can go back to Stalin. I mean, all these people that didn't believe in God, even in current times, became animals. I don't know, when Susan said that, it just struck a note.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the power that faith can play and how it grounds and centers our life and our being. Yeah. That imagery came to my mind too.
Y'all have much loftier thoughts than I do. When I heard raised up on one side, it sounded to me like a dog cocking its leg. Just saying.
That's a good vision, because he did piss all over Babylon, right?
That puts a different perspective on it. All right, so
In the previous chapter, they mentioned loosened his hips, which could also mean, went in his pants. When Belshazzar, saw writing on the wall that he went in his pants.
Yep. All right, so getting into the imagery of this creature that's like a bear. All right, so the NRSV translates in verse 5 that it had 3 tusks in its mouth among its teeth. So when I read that, the imagery that comes in my mind is he's got 3 tusks growing out of his mouth. But Xiao makes this point. He does not like that translation. And so I wonder if like in your NIV, how it translates it.
It's 3 ribs.
3 ribs. All right.
In his
And
mouth.
that's how Xiao thinks it should be translated. My New Jerusalem Bible says ribs also. And so the imagery of his attack on creatures and stuff, he's got 3 ribs hanging out of his mouth that he's been chowing down on.
Ooh.
Right, which is to me a very different kind of imagery.
Yeah.
So the translations matter.
Well, it says arise, devour many bodies, so.
Yeah, right. Yep. So anyhow, so the ribs versus tusks issue. All right.
And that makes sense with the next line in my translation, because it said it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. So that makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, and he didn't get into why it was translated tusk for the NSRV, but anyhow, NRSV, but it is. So moving on to the third creature, the like a leopard. All right. And apparently this like a leopard, because he had, where'd he go? he had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads. So you can imagine, I don't know whether they're bird heads or leopard heads, but he's got, it's a frightening vision.
Or 2 each,
Anyway, yep, huh?
or 2 each.
Or 2, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Okay. All right, so this imagery is similar to a vision that Ezekiel had, where he saw a sphinx-like creature, so creature that had some cat characteristics, but having 4 faces and 4 wings also, just as an aside. So in Ezekiel's vision, that creature bore the throne that symbolized the absolute power of God. But here in Daniel's vision, by contrast, dominion was given to the monster, so a little bit more of a passive action again. But he was given dominion as though God had given dominion. Remember, you know, there was Daniel's comment earlier, you know, about how Nebuchadnezzar had been given power. So, so anyhow, so, but so if you went in sequence of the rulers, Darius the Mede or Mede, you know, was succeeded by Cyrus. So theoretically, this leopard being representative of Cyrus the Persian. All right. So getting into Cyrus as the Persian, you know, there's dangerous forces that have to be subdued for the well-being of the universe. So getting into the 4th one, all right. So in verse 7, after this, I saw in the visions by night a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. The great iron teeth, you know, I immediately thought of the statue and the iron in the statue in the earlier vision with Nebuchadnezzar. And this one is, but he's devouring, he's breaking things in pieces, he's stamping things. And so it was different in that it had 10 horns. All right, so these 10 horns are thought to have been 10 Greek rulers before Antiochus IV. All right, so a succession of the Greek rulers. And then these 3, so there were the 10 horns, but then there were the horns, another horn appeared, and a little one coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of the earlier horns were plucked out by the roots. So those 3 horns and that 1 horn are thought to represent the succession, the most recent succession at the time this was written, that led to Antiochus, and that last horn representing Antiochus. All right, because there was a quick succession of like 3 Greek rulers, and then Antiochus came in.
Yeah, well, you know, we have read somewhere in previous classes how horns meant kingdoms, you know, or rulers. But I mean, that we in some of the other New Old Testament, we have come across horns and representing kings or kingdoms.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so so Harold, along that point, then Antiochus IV, one of the things he did was he made a claim for himself, that his name should be Theos Epiphanes, which is Greek for God manifest. That was how he wanted to be referred to, as God manifest. So that gives a flavor for his rule and what things were like during that time.
And the mouth speaking arrogantly.
Arrogantly, and the mouth speaking arrogantly. Yes, yes. Okay, so now if we look at verses 9 and 10, if somebody would read that real quick. And I want to, if you're reading in the book, and it depends on the Bible, you'll see that these two verses are written out rather than in prose. In the Aramaic, they switched to poetry. So that's why they're written out differently in a lot of Bibles in verses. Okay.
As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. That's Revelation. The books were opened.
All right. So a big shift in imagery here with those two, with those lines of poetry. So what's the imagery? What are they describing? What are these lines describing?
Sounds like God to me.
Yeah, his clothing white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool. Either that or bud, one or the other.
It's not his.
Well, he doesn't have the pure wool, but you know, his clothing white as snow, and Bud's got on a white sweater this morning. So what more can we ask?
There you go.
You
All right.
this, talking about the books being opened, and you mentioned Revelation, but of course, this may be where Revelation, John got his idea of the books. This was written far before Revelation.
Right.
Right. And these, and I forgot to mention this earlier, throughout the Old Testament, there are other prophets who had dreams and whose dreams or visions are part of their books, like Ezekiel and Nehemiah. And so this was not unusual for prophets to write down, to include in their writings the visions and stuff that they had. Okay, so these images of a divine power, some of this imagery is similar to some Canaanite writings and imagery as well. Especially its wheels were burning fire, and the whiteness as well. And then
Well, fire is often the symbol of God.
mhm,
We
Right.
see it in the pillars of fire when they're leaving Egypt, and the fiery bush.
yes. All right, so now I'm moving into verses 11 through 14. All right, Sarah, would you read those?
Hold on. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one coming like a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed.
All right, so what's this imagery suggesting? As Christians, what's the first thing that we think of?
Jesus.
Christ, right. That's going to be our quick, but other, a Messiah, the Jews would have thought of a Messiah, that kind of thing. All right. So there's not a prolonged battle. The Ancient One was on his throne, and he took care of this, like, boom. All right. In the Canaanite mythology, there was a long battle, but not in here. Seattle talks a lot about in verse 13, I saw one like a human being, which is translated in the NRSV as human being. But he says that the Aramaic word that is sometimes translated as son of man. So I don't know if any of the other Bibles have it listed another way,
Like a son of man is what mine has.
like a son of man. Seattle talks about, though, the word in Aramaic meaning, and he's using it not just referring to it not in terms of just its usage here, but in other places too, referring to a mere human, just like a regular Joe kind of person. So this is a passage where the reader is going to, we're more likely to, put our own meaning onto it. But the original Aramaic was sort of talking about just a mere human, a son of man, a servant of man. So, okay. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So this mysterious, this figure that came out of the cloud, that came with the clouds, also Ciel says corresponds to that stone that was not cut by human hands in Daniel 2. Remember that? And but both represent divine response to the threat of domination by pernicious, I love that word, pernicious earthly powers. Just as Daniel has previously asserted that God is the only one who gives the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, so too one understands that God now gives dominion and glory and kingship, that comes from God. We've seen that again. All right, anybody want to read 15 through 27?
I can do it.
Okay. You can
I
do
got
it.
it first. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was troubled within me, and the visions of my head terrified me. I approached one of the attendants to ask him the truth concerning all
Okay,
this.
let me interject here. The attendants is one of the heavenly attendants. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, still in the screen.
So he said that he would disclose to me the interpretation of the matter. As for
Now,
these
Daniel
four,
doesn't need anyone to interpret anything.
as for these four great beasts, 4 kings shall arise out of the earth, but the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth concerning the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn which came up, and to make room for which 3 of them fell out, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke arrogantly, and that seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones, and was prevailing over them, until the Ancient One came. Then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the king. How far did you say to go?
Through 27.
Okay, got it. This is what he said. As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall rise, and another shall rise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and they shall attempt to change the sacred season and the law, and they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them.
Okay, so some of this is kind of reiterating what was said earlier, but the terms for in verse 25, for a time, 2 times, and half a time, is really unclear quite what that meant. And Sal says it could be interpreted or translated in different ways. But the kingship of the heaven, under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High, and their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom. So to me, it sounds like there's some pretty clear references. You know, he tried to, was really destructive, this king, who was thought to be Antiochus IV, where it says, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. He changed the calendar from the solar calendar to the lunar calendar, is what that may be referring to. So, and then the last verse, because we're running out of time. Here the account ends. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly terrified me, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter in my mind. So even with this interpretation, he doesn't experience the relief that Nebuchadnezzar and the other guys did after their dream wasn't. He is still quite anxious and worried. His mind is still troubled. So his fears have to do with the enormity of the evil threat, the implication that suffering is inevitable, since the holy ones of the Most High would be delivered into the hand of the terrible oppressor in the person of the little horn. The terror may have arisen too because of the lack of a clear indication of when oppression might end. It may last for a period or many periods, or it may only last a part of a period. You know, I couldn't help but think of Ukraine at this point. You know, we're not sure where this is all going. So anyhow, with chapter 8, I thought we did in chapter 8, but the imagery shifts again. Even though it's set to be in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar, it becomes even a clearer analogy of what's going on with the Greeks. So Sarah gets to talk about that next week.